Hey guys, tonight we delve into a world both ancient and surprisingly gritty. Picture this. You're basking in the golden light of the Egyptian sun, the Nile River shimmering like a ribbon of life beside you. Palm trees sway, and the air, though palm trees sway, warm, carries the promise of baking bread. But as you reach for that warm, inviting loaf, you bite down and crunch. Not the satisfying crunch of a perfect crust, but the unwelcome grit of sand. It's in your teeth, on your tongue, a constant, unwelcome companion. Honestly, if you were transported back there with your modern sensibilities about food hygiene, you probably wouldn't survive this particular culinary adventure for a week without staging a protest, or at least inventing the protest first dental floss out of sheer desperation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our Robo Night Owl community. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the fertile banks of that majestic river, the lifeblood of an entire civilization, the Nile. It's the core of ancient Egypt, the fountainhead of its agricultural richness, its prosperity, its very essence. Without the Nile, there is no fertile black land, the cherished Ankh-meat. There is only the boundless red land, the wide desert stretching infinitely in all directions, a vast ocean of sand, and that sand, oh, that insidious sand, it's far more than just a feature of the landscape. It's an atmospheric constant, an unwelcome seasoning in the very air you inhale, a subtle flavor in the water you sip, and most vexingly for our ancient forebears, a persistent, uninvited ingredient in their daily sustenance. Bread. In the land of the Pharaohs, bread wasn't merely a dietary accompaniment. It was the staff of life itself. Together with beer, it formed the undeniable foundation of the Egyptian diet, so utterly fundamental that often workers' wages were disbursed in precisely these commodities, loaves of bread and jars of beer. Picture that for a moment. Your supervisor concluding the work week by handing you a hefty stack of carbohydrates and a generous supply of ale. It might sound appealing, doesn't it? Except, of course, for the sand, for the ordinary Egyptian citizen. A certain measure of grit in their daily their ubiquitous term for bread, was simply an accepted, albeit unpleasant, facet of their existence. You'd learn to chew with their existence. Caution, perhaps cultivate a specific oral dexterity for isolating the sandy particles with your tongue, or more likely, you'd just resign yourself to a future of progressively eroding dental. Indeed, contemporary Egyptologists and paleopathologists examining Egyptian mummies consistently observe teeth that are severely worn. This isn't solely attributed to a generally coarse diet, but is significantly exacerbated by the chronic abrasion from sand and other lithic particles present in their food. It's a stark, tangible testament, etched into their very bones, of the sandy reality of their daily meals. But your perspective in this nocturnal exploration isn't that of just any Egyptian. No. We are ascending the Egyptian social ladder, aiming for the very pinnacle of power, into the rarefied atmosphere of Pharaoh's own presence, or indeed, Her Majesty's, as formidable female rulers like Hatshepsut so vividly remind us. And for Pharaoh, the living incarnation of a deity, a scion of the sun god Ra, a sovereign whose personal well-being was inextricably intertwined with the prosperity and cosmic order of the entire realm. Consuming sandy bread was not merely an inconvenience. It was an affront, was a systemic failure. It was, to put it mildly, unbefitting divinity. The royal palate, accustomed to the most succulent dates, the choicest morsels of fatted calf, the most exquisite and sweet wines, was certainly not to be sullied by common dessert detritus. Thus, the core of our problem crystallizes. Egypt is an inherently sandy environment. Bread is an indispensable staple. Pharaoh cannot, and indeed must not, be served sandy bread. This predicament lays the groundwork for a culinary undertaking of monumental proportions, a veritable quest for purity in a world seemingly conspiring to contaminate every single mouthful. One might reasonably ask, where did all this pervasive sand actually originate? The most evident culprit, naturally, is the desert itself. Egypt, after all, is a civilization born of a river valley, dramatically carved out of one of the planet's most extensive arid wildernesses. The wind, that relentless desert zephyr, or khamsin, as these hot, sandy winds are sometimes called, would tirelessly whip up fine silicate particles, transporting them ubiquitously. This airborne sand would gently settle upon the grain drying patiently in the fields, upon the hard-packed earth of the threshing floors where oxen laboriously trod out the harvest, and upon the flat rooftops where precious grain might be stored awaiting processing. Historians still argue whether the predominant grain was a specific variety of emmer, wheat, or if barley played a more significant role in certain periods or regions. But whatever the crop, protecting it from this continuous aerial bombardment of grit was an unceasing struggle. Envision the scene during the bustling harvest season. Agricultural workers, their bodies glistening with perspiration under the unforgiving glare of the Egyptian sun, meticulously cut the golden stalks of emmer wheat or barley. These harvested grains are then gathered into sheaves and transported to a designated threshing floor, typically a wide open area of ground intentionally hardened by trampling and drying. Upon this surface, cattle are driven in endless circles, their heavy hooves methodically separating the precious grain heads from the largely inedible stalks. A cloud of dust and lighter chaff inevitably rises into the air, mingling with that omnipresent desert dust. Even the subsequent winnowing process, where workers skillfully toss the threshed mixture into the air, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff and straw, presents a paradoxical challenge. While effectively removing the unwanted chaff, it also provides those cunningly minute sand particles yet another prime opportunity to integrate themselves with the grain. It's akin to attempting a seaside picnic on a blustery day and harboring the faintest hope that your sandwiches will remain entirely free of sand, a valiant, if utterly futile, aspiration. Then consider the water source. The Nile, while majestic and life-sustaining, also transported considerable quantities of silt and, yes, finer sand particles, particularly during its annual inundation phase. While this rich silt was phenomenally beneficial for fertilizing the agricultural lands, if the water drawn for food preparation wasn't meticulously allowed to settle or undergo some rudimentary filtration, it too could contribute to the overall grit content of the final product. Perhaps its contribution wasn't as substantial as that of the airborne sand or the attrition from the grinding stones we'll soon explore, but every minuscule grain compounded the crunchy, unwelcome textural problem, and it wasn't merely the vast, untamed desert that posed a threat. Reflect for a moment on the immediate domestic environment. Dwellings, even the grandest of palaces, were predominantly constructed from sun-dried mud brick, while often elegantly plastered and adorned with vibrant frescoes in wealthier residences. The fundamental construction materials were sourced directly from the earth. Floors might be simple packed earth, easily disturbed. Courtyards, integral to Egyptian architecture, were typically open to the theatric elements, inviting airborne particles. Sand could be unwittingly trekked in on reed sandals, wafted in through unglazed window openings, and generally insinuate itself into every nook and cranny. It's rather like the mysterious way pet hair seems to spontaneously materialize in every corner of a modern home, regardless of how diligently one vacuums. For the ancient Egyptians, sand was that same ubiquitous, relentless invader. A quirky, slightly amusing tidbit from the annals of Egyptology is the intricate cosmetic rituals practiced by the Egyptians. Those famously iconic koa-lined eyes, for example, koa, a dark eyeliner, was frequently manufactured from galena, lead sulfide, which itself was ground into a fine powder on small stone pallets. Even the pursuit of beauty, it seems, was not entirely immune to the potential introduction of unwanted grit. Consequently, the royal household, and with laser focus, the royal bakers, were confronted with a task of immense complexity. Their charge was to take a fundamental foodstuff, produced from raw ingredients inherently and repeatedly exposed to sand contamination at numerous stages from field to storage, and miraculously transform it into a product deemed suitable for a god-king. This endeavor transcended mere culinary skill. It was deeply enmeshed with the maintenance of status, the concept of ritual purity, and perhaps even the upholding of the perceived cosmic equilibrium. The demand for sand-free bread was not born of some trivial, fussy preference. It was a direct reflection of the profound social and religious gravitas accorded to the pharaoh. Their sustenance needed to be as unblemished as the ideal of Ima'at they were believed to personify. The pressure on these bakers was immense, and any failure to deliver a smooth, grit-free dining experience could precipitate consequences far more severe than a scathing review on an ancient papyrus, equivalent of a foodie blog. We are, after all, talking about the very real possibility of incurring the displeasure of a deity, or at the very least, his terrestrial region. No pressure at all, right? The very notion of delightfully sand-free bread, the central theme of our exploration tonight, represented a concerted counter-offensive against their natural environment. It necessitated an extraordinary degree of meticulousness, considerable ingenuity, and likely a healthy measure of sheer desperation. This quest was not solely about feeding Pharaoh. It was about conquering, in a small yet symbolically significant manner, the relentless siege of the desert upon the refined, protected world of the royal court. It was a culinary war, waged anew each day, with every carefully measured batch of dough, every precise firing of the oven, and the narrative of how they achieved this, or at least how they valiantly endeavored to, offers us a captivating insight into the fascinating nexus of ancient technology, rigid social hierarchy, and the timeless, universal human aspiration for a good, clean, and satisfying meal. The stage is now perfectly set. A faint, dry winding whispers from the distant desert, carrying its invisible, sandy payload. The granaries are filled to capacity, but is their precious content truly pure? And deep within the sprawling palace complex, a dedicated team of royal bakers is about to commence their day's labor, acutely conscious that their every effort will be judged at the most elevated, most discerning, and arguably most critical table in the entire land. Their formidable challenge to transmute the sandy, gritty reality of Egyptian agriculture into a sublime dream of perfectly smooth, divinely palatable, and royally satisfying bread. Let us now begin to uncover how they even started to approach this daunting task. So you're now standing, perhaps a little uncomfortably, in this ancient world where the very air seems to shimmer with fine particles. The royal bakers as we noted, have a monumental task, but to truly appreciate the genius of their potential solutions, you need to understand just how deeply ingrained sand was in the fabric of daily and external nuisance. It wasn't merely an external nuisance. It was an intimate, unwelcome houseguest in every home, from the humblest laborer's dwelling to the sprawling palace complexes. Imagine trying to keep your own kitchen pristine if your backyard was a desert and your windows had no glass. You'd be fighting a losing battle with dust bunnies the size of small cats, and these bunnies would be made of sand. Let's start with where people lived. Most Egyptian homes were constructed from mud brick, a fantastic, readily available building material made from Nile mud, straw, and, yes, sand. When these bricks dried, they were durable, but weren't impervious to wear and tear. Over time, the surfaces could crumble a little, releasing fine particles into the living space. Floors were often made of packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats, while these mats might offer a degree of comfort and could be shaken out. The act of walking on them, sweeping them, or what passed for sweeping, would inevitably stir up dust from below and within the mats themselves. It's like that one rug in your house that, no matter how many times you vacuum it, always seems to hide a secret stash of crumbs and mystery fluff. Except here, it's a pervasive layer of fine grit. You'd feel it underfoot, a slight grittiness on every surface. You'd probably get used to it, the way one gets used to the distant hum of traffic in a city. But it would always be there. Think about your clothes and bedding. Linen was the primary textile, a wonderfully cool and light fabric for the Egyptian climate. But where do you think the flax was grown, ratted, spun, and woven? Often in close proximity to sandy fields or dusty villages. Even after washing in Nile water, which, as we've discussed, had its own sediment issues, tiny particles could cling to the fibers. You'd lie down on your wooden bed, perhaps with a woven mat for a mattress and a distinctive wooden or stone headrest. Comfort goes, right, and the slight abrasion of your own movement could dislodge particles from the textiles or the bed structure itself. It wouldn't be like sleeping in a sandpit, not usually, but a subtle, constant presence. You'd wake up, and there might be a little film of dust on surfaces, a daily reminder from the desert that it was always knocking at the door. Now, let's turn our attention more specifically to the food supply chain, long before it even reaches the specialized environment of the royal bakery. Consider the granaries. Grain was the wealth of Egypt, the foundation of its economy and sustenance. Huge quantities of emmer wheat, barley, and other grains were stored, sometimes for extended periods, in specially constructed silos or granary buildings. These were often beehive-shaped structures or rectangular complexes of chambers, typically made of mud brick, while efforts were undoubtedly made to protect this vital resource from pests like rodents and insects. A whole other story of ancient pest control, involving cats and weasels. Sealing these structures perfectly against fine, windblown sand was an almost insurmountable challenge. Tiny gaps in the mud brick around wooden doors or loading hatches would be an open invitation for dust every time grain was moved, scooped, measured, transported. It created an opportunity for settled dust to become airborne again and mingle with the kernels. It's a historical fact that these granaries were central to the state's power, meticulously recorded and managed by scribes. The sheer volume passing through meant countless opportunities for contamination. Then there's the water. We've touched on the Nile's sediment load, but let's explore that a bit more. Water for drinking, cooking, and washing was drawn from the river, from irrigation canals, or from wells, while the Egyptians were skilled hydraulic engineers. Particularly with their large-scale irrigation, water purification at a household level was rudimentary. Often, water would be collected in pottery jars and allowed to stand, so some of the heavier sediment could settle to the bottom. You then try to decant the clearer water from the top, but how effective was this against the finest particles? And what about the act of dipping a vessel into the river or canal? The very motion could stir up sediment from the bottom. Historians still debate the exact designs and efficacy of local water catchment and storage systems in various settlement types, but it's safe to say that consistently clear, sediment-free water was a luxury, not a given. So, any water added to dough or used to wash food or utensil carried a potential payload of microscopic grit. Imagine the marketplace, a vibrant, bustling hub of activity. Farmers bring their produce, fishermen their catch, artisans their wares. It's dusty. Animals are present, donkeys, oxen, goats kicking up dust. People are moving, bartering, their feet and robes stirring the ground. Food items, displayed in baskets or on mats, are exposed to this environment. Date, figs, vegetables, all could receive a light coating of airborne particles. Even something as simple as grinding spices on a stone pallet could introduce tiny fragments from the stone itself, if it wasn't of the highest quality. Remember that coal eyeliner being ground. The same principle applies to food preparation tools. It's a bit like that health warning you see on food packets. Might contain traces of nuts, soya, sand. The Egyptians just lived with the might contain sand part for pretty much everything. Even the act of cooking itself, before we get to the specialized bakers, could introduce sand. Open fires or simple clay ovens were common. Fuel, often dried animal dung or wood, could contain earthy impurities that, when burned, might become ash and dust, settling on food being cooked nearby. Pots, usually made of Nile clay, which contains fine sand naturally, could shed tiny particles, especially if they weren't perfectly fired or if they were scrubbed with abrasive materials like sand itself, a rather counterproductive cleaning method if you're trying to avoid grit, but sometimes you use what you have. The irony of cleaning with the very substance you wish to avoid is not lost on us, is it? It's like fighting fire with, well, slightly more flammable fire. This pervasive grittiness wasn't just a physical irritant. One can only imagine the subtle psychological wear of it. The constant awareness, even if subconscious, of that slight, abrasive quality to life. The gritty film on your teeth after a meal, the dust in your eyes on a windy day, the knowledge that the cool water you craved might also add to your internal sand collection. It makes the Egyptian emphasis on cleanliness and purity, especially in religious and royal contexts, all the more understandable. They weren't just being fussy. They were actively battling an environment that relentlessly sought to coat everything in a fine layer of the desert. One rather quirky, though not directly food-related, tidbit is the discovery of ancient Egyptian wooden combs, some of which are incredibly fine-toothed, while primarily for hair, and sometimes for delousing, another delightful aspect of ancient life. One can't help but wonder if they also inadvertently combed out a fair bit of ambient dust and sand that had settled on people's elaborate hairstyles and wigs. Perhaps the original dry shampoo effect, with a bit of added exfoliation for the scalp. So when you picture the royal bakers beginning their work, you must realize they weren't starting with pristine, lab-grade ingredients in a hermetically sealed clean room. They were receiving grain that had already run a gauntlet of sandy encounters to be mixed with water that whispered of riverbeds in an environment where the air itself was a carrier. The challenge wasn't just to avoid adding more sand. It was to actively remove what was already there, a task requiring almost obsessive attention to detail and a deep understanding of their materials. The journey of that grain, from the moment it was harvested to the point it was handed over to the bakery, was fraught with opportunities for contamination. Stage, threshing, winnowing, transport, storage was a potential pitfall. The life of an ancient Egyptian, and by extension their food, had a truly gritty texture. Understanding this constant battle against the elements is key to appreciating the efforts made to provide a smooth, untainted loaf for the most powerful person in the land. You're beginning to feel it now, aren't you? That fine, ever-present grit working its way into your awareness, just as it worked its way into every corner of ancient Egyptian life. We've seen how the food supply itself, from the field to the storage jar, was under constant siege from sand. Now, let's zero in on that most powerful person in the land, the Pharaoh, and understand why for him or her a sand-free loaf wasn't just a preference. It was an absolute, non-negotiable imperative. This wasn't about being a picky eater. It was about divinity, cosmic order, and the very stability of the kingdom. First and foremost, you have to remember who the Pharaoh was believed to be. This wasn't just a king or an emperor in the way we might think of a secular ruler. Pharaoh was a god on earth, the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, a direct link between the mortal realm and the divine. His well-being was intrinsically tied to the well-being of Egypt itself. If Pharaoh prospered, Egypt prospered. Egypt prospered. Pharaoh was in harmony. The land would be in harmony. Food offerings presented in temples to the gods were always of the highest quality, meticulously prepared, and ritually pure. Since Pharaoh was a god, shouldn't his daily bread meet the same exacting standards? To offer a deity, even one walking among mortals, food that was contaminated with common earth, with the grit of the desert, would be almost blasphemous. It would be like serving ambrosia with a handful of gravel mixed in. Smite you instantly, but they certainly wouldn't be pleased, and keeping the gods happy was paramount. This ties directly into the core Egyptian concept of Ma'at. We touched on it briefly before, but it's so crucial here. Ma'at represented order, truth, justice, balance, and harmony, the divinely established and correct way of the cosmos. Its opposite was Wisfet, chaos, disorder, and falsehood. Disorder and falsehood. Pharaoh's primary role, beyond all the administrative and military duties, was to uphold Ma'at. Every ritual, every decree, every aspect of royal life was, in theory, geared towards maintaining this cosmic balance. Now, imagine a gritty, sandy loaf of bread placed on the royal table. In a world so attuned to symbolism, this wouldn't just be an unpleasant meal. It would be a tiny intrusion of wisfet, of disorder, into the perfectly ordered world that Pharaoh was supposed to inhabit and project. It's like finding a typo in a sacred text, jarring and indicative that something, somewhere, is not quite right. The food consumed by the divine ruler had to be as pure and unblemished as the ideal of Ma'at itself. Then there are the more practical, if still elevated, considerations of health. We know from examining mummies that ordinary Egyptians, and even many nobles, suffered significant tooth abrasion due to sand in their diet. Their teeth are often worn flat, sometimes down to the pulp, leading to abscesses and other painful dental problems. You can just imagine the chronic discomfort. Now, while Pharaoh was divine, he was also housed in a mortal body. The health of the ruler was of supreme state importance. A pharaoh incapacitated by dental issues or severe indigestion, because swallowing sand can't be good for the digestive tract either, would be a crisis. While they didn't have modern dentistry, you can be sure that every effort was made to preserve the pharaoh's physical well-being. Ensuring his food was as pure as possible was a fundamental part of that. It's a mainstream historical fact that the pharaoh was considered the chief priest of every temple in the land, and his ability to perform rituals was vital, A toothache could seriously derail a sacred ceremony meant to ensure a good harvest. Think about the sheer luxury and refinement that surrounded the pharaoh. The painted reliefs and surviving artifacts from royal tombs and palaces show a life of incredible opulence, at least by ancient standards. Fine linens, exquisite jewelry, perfumed oils, elaborate furnishings, gardens, music, and of course, the best food and drink the kingdom could offer. The royal sphere was meant to be a haven of perfection, a reflection of the divine realm on earth. Sand, with its connotations of the harsh, uncontrolled desert and the struggles of common labor, was an unwelcome intruder in this carefully constructed paradise. It was a bit like finding a clump of mud on a pristine silk carpet in a modern mansion. It just doesn't belong. Allowing such a base contaminant into the pharaoh's personal provisions would diminish the aura of sanctity and separation that was so carefully cultivated around the royal person. The royal bakers weren't just making food, experience of divine perfection, one bite at a time. There's also the element of setting a standard. The demands of the royal court often spurred innovation and excellence in craftsmanship, whether in art, architecture, or indeed the culinary art. If the pharaoh demanded sand-free bread, then systems and techniques would have to be developed to achieve it. This pursuit of purity at the top could, in theory, have ripple effects, even if the most refined techniques remained exclusive to the palace. It's a bit like how Formula One racing technology eventually trickles down into passenger cars. The extreme demand drives the initial innovation. The very existence of a sand-free bread department in the royal kitchens implies a level of specialization and resource allocation that wouldn't exist without that top-level insistence. Can you imagine the head baker's performance review? Well, Akhenaten complained twice this week about grit. That's 2 strikes, Mr. Historians still debate the precise level of personal involvement pharaohs had in the minutiae of temple offerings versus delegating these tasks to high priests. However, there's little doubt that what Pharaoh Jah personally consumed was of direct concern. The intimate act of eating made the purity of the food a very personal matter. There are even some accounts, though often from later periods or interpreted from complex religious texts, that hint at specific dietary preferences or taboos for rulers, all aimed at maintaining ritual purity or enhancing divine connection. Adding "must be delightfully sand-free" to that list seems entirely plausible. And let's not forget simple human comfort. Even if you are a god king, grit in your teeth is unpleasant. The sensation of chewing on sand, the potential for a jarring crunch that could chip a tooth, even a divine one. The aftertaste, none of it is conducive to a pleasant dining experience. Pharaohs, their divinity, were still human beings with sensory perceptions. They would have appreciated a smooth-textured loaf just as much as anyone else, perhaps even much as anyone else, more so, given they were accustomed to the very best of everything. A gritty piece of bread might not cause a cosmic imbalance on its own, but it could certainly ruin the royal appetite, and an unhappy pharaoh could make for an unhappy kingdom. It's probably not a good career move for a royal baker to be the source of divine indigestion. Perhaps there was an ancient Egyptian equivalent of a royal taster, not just for poison, but also for texture. Too gritty. Try again. And for Ra's sake, get it right this time before the divine patience wears thin. One quirky tidbit from Egyptian religious practice is the opening of the mouth ceremony. This complex ritual was performed on statues of gods or deceased individuals and their mummies to enable them to breathe, speak, see, hear, and get drinking in the afterlife. The instruments used were quite specific, and the ritual emphasized the animation of the senses. If the ability to eat and enjoy food was so important that it needed to be magically bestowed for eternity, then surely the thorough quality of that food in the here and now, especially for the living god Pharaoh, was of utmost importance. Sand-laced bread wouldn't be a fitting meal to sustain a deity whose senses were meant to be ritually awakened and divinely potent. So, you see, the demand for sand-free bread for Pharaoh wasn't just a whim. It was deeply rooted in religious ideology. The concept of cosmic order, concerns for the ruler's health and ritual purity, the maintenance of royal prestige, and basic comforter. The entire system was geared toward elevating Pharaoh above the mundane, and the mundane in Egypt was unavoidably sandy. The royal bakers, therefore, weren't just employees. They were vital cogs in the machinery of state, tasked with a delicious, doughy form of diplomacy, keeping the Pharaoh, and by extension the gods and the cosmos, perfectly happy and grit-free. Their quest for the perfectly smooth loaf was, in its own way, a quest to uphold Ima itself, one bite at a time. You can almost feel the weight of that divine expectation, can't you? The pressing need to uphold Ima'at through something as seemingly simple as a loaf of bread. So, with this understanding of why sand-free bread was a royal decree of the highest order, let's push past the antechambers and gilded halls of the palace, venturing into a far more practical, yet equally vital, part of the royal complex. The Pharaoh's personal bakery. This isn't your quaint village bakery with a friendly, flour-dusted proprietor. No, this is an operation of considerable scale and critical importance, a place humming with activity, thick with the smells of yeast and heat, and buzzing with an undercurrent of intense pressure. Step inside, if you will, into this domain of dough. The first thing that might strike you is the sheer organized chaos. It's likely a series of interconnected rooms or a dedicated courtyard area, possibly open-aired in parts to dissipate some of the intense heat, but strategically sheltered to minimize the ever-present threat of airborne sand we talked about earlier. Remember those desert winds? They're still out there waiting for any lapse in vigilance. So, walls might be higher here, or reed screens might be cleverly placed to act as windbreaks, a constant, silent battle against the encroaching grit. The floors would likely be off hard-packed earth, or perhaps paved with flagstones in the more critical areas, kept as clean as possible through constant sweeping. Though sweeping itself, as we know, can be a double-edged sword, stirring up as much as it removes if not done carefully with dampened brushes or sprinkled water. The air is warm, almost palpably so, especially near the ovens. You'd smell the comforting aroma of baking bread, a scent that has captivated humans for millennia. But it would be mingled with the sharper tang of yeast, the sweetness of malt if they were preparing leavening agents, and the pervasive, slightly acrid smell of wood smoke or burning charcoal from the ovens. Depending on the scale, and the royal household could be vast, encompassing not just Pharaoh's immediate family but also a legion of officials, priests, servants, and honored guests. This bakery would be a veritable hive of activity. A mainstream historical fact is that reliefs in tombs, like those of Ramesses at Medinet Habu, depict extensive bakery and brewery scenes, indicating these were large, well-organized production facilities. These weren't just for show. They were essential to the functioning of the royal estate and its obligations. You see dozens of people, each with a specific role in the intricate ballet of bread production. This wasn't a one-man show. There would be a clear hierarchy, from the chief of bakers or overseer of the bakery, a position of a bakery, considerable responsibility, who probably had more sleepless nights than Pharaoh himself, down to the apprentices learning the craft. Imagine the overseer, perhaps a stern-faced individual with flour permanently etched into the lines on his hands, his eyes darting everywhere, ensuring every step is followed with meticulous precision. His job isn't just to produce bread, but to produce perfect bread, fit for a god. One sandy loaf making its way to the royal table could mean a very bad day for him, possibly involving an unpleasant chat with the palace vizier, or worse. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of you had one job, probably carried a lot more weight. There would be teams dedicated to receiving and inspecting the grain, even after its perilous journey from the fields and granaries. As we discussed in Section 2, it would undergo another scrutiny here. Then you'd have the grinders, often women, rhythmically working at the saddle querns, if that stage was still centralized here, or perhaps overseeing larger rotary querns, if such advancements were in use for the initial coarse milling. Theirs was a physically demanding job, and a crucial one, as the grinding stones themselves were a primary source of sand contamination, a problem we'll delve into more deeply soon. Further along the production line, you'd see the sifters patiently, and you see the sifters diligently working their sieves, their movements precise and repetitive. This was a critical descending stage. Others would be kneading the dough in large pottery troughs or on wooden tables, their arms strong and dusted with flour. Historians still debate the exact range of leavening agents and techniques they used. Besides sourdough starters captured from wild yeasts, was it always the same method, or did they have different processes for different types of bread? You might see specialized bakers shaping the dough into a myriad of forms, not just the everyday conical loaves, but bedja, or flatbreads, but perhaps more elaborate shapes for special occasions or specific offerings. Egyptian bakers were known for offerings, producing dozens of varieties of bread and cake, some sweetened with honey or date, some spiced, some in fanciful forms. One quirky tidbit is the existence of bread molds in various shapes, including animals or even human figures, which were even human figures, likely used for particular religious festivals or temple offerings. The royal bakery might have had a special novelty loaf department for all we know. Then, of course, there are the ovens. These could range from simple fire pits with bread baked in the hot ashes or on heated stones, to more sophisticated updraft pottery ovens, preheated, and then the bread baked directly on the hot interior surface or on pottery sherds, managing the fires, maintaining the correct baking temperature, and knowing the exact moment to retrieve the golden brown loaves required immense skill and experience. You'd see men, faces ruddy from the heat, skillfully sliding dough into the fiery mouths of the ovens and pulling out perfectly baked bread with long wooden peels. The heat would be intense, the air shimmering around the oven openings. It makes you appreciate your modern thermostat-controlled oven, doesn't it? No low fan or grill setting here, just raw heat and expert judgment. The noise level would be a constant hum, the rhythmic scraping of stone on stone from the grinders, the thudding and slapping of dough being kneaded, the murmur of voices, though probably kept to a minimum to maintain focus, the crackle of fires, and the orders of the overseers. It would be a place of intense, focused labor, and the pressure. Oh, the pressure. Oh, the pressure. Every single person in that bakery, from the lowest helper sweeping the floor to the chief baker himself, would understand the ultimate destination of their product. This wasn't just for the local market stall. This was for Pharaoh. The standards were impossibly high. Mistakes were not easily tolerated. The term quality control might not have been invented yet, but the principle was certainly in full effect. You can imagine a stern-faced inspector, perhaps a priest or a palace official, whose sole job was to sample the bread, checking for texture, taste, and above all, any hint of that dreaded grit, Perhaps they had a 3 strikes and you're out to the crocodile pools policy for consistently sandy bread. A bit of gallows humor, perhaps, but the stakes were undeniably high. The raw ingredients arriving at the bakery, the grain, the water, the yeast cultures, would already be under suspicion, as we've established. The bakery itself, despite best efforts, was part of a sandy world. So, the challenge for the royal bakers was twofold. First, to prevent any additional contamination within their own walls, and second, and more importantly, to actively remove the sand that had already infiltrated the ingredients. This required not just skill, but a system, a series of carefully thought-out procedures, each designed to purify the product step by step. This royal bakery was, in essence, a miniature purification plant, transforming the gritty reality of Egyptian agriculture into something sublime and divinely smooth. The pressure to succeed was immense, but so too was the pride in being part of such a vital, high-status operation, directly serving the divine ruler and contributing, in their own way, to the maintenance of Turn. You're now firmly planted within the bustling, aromatic, and slightly stressful confines of the royal bakery. The weight of expectation for that divinely perfect, sand-free loaf settles upon this place like a fine layer of, well, hopefully not dust, as we touched upon. The ingredients arriving here, especially the star of the show, the grain, are already seasoned veterans of Egypt's sandy embrace. They've traveled from fields caressed by desert winds, threshed on earthen floors, journeyed through granaries where tiny particles lie in wait. The bakers, under the watchful eye of their overseer, know that their quest for purity begins not with the kneading trough or the oven, but with these very kernels of wheat or barley. This is the first line of defense, the initial, crucial skirmish in the daily war against grit. So, picture the scene. Sacks or baskets of emmer wheat or barley are delivered to a designated receiving area within the bakery complex. This area itself is likely chosen or designed to be as sheltered as possible. Before any milling can even be contemplated, the grain undergoes its first intensive spa treatment, Egyptian style, though it's less about pampering and more about purification. The very first step is selection and meticulous manual inspection. You'd see workers, perhaps those with the keenest eyesight and the most patient dispositions, poring over shallow trays or spread out heaps of grain. Their fingers would expertly sift through the kernels, picking out the more obvious intruders. Small pebbles that somehow got scooped up with the harvest, stray twigs, perhaps a mummified grasshopper who met an untimely end, clumps of dried earth, or even an unfortunate rodent dropping that evaded earlier detection. It's a tedious, painstaking process, akin to being a human sorting machine. You'd need good light, intense focus, and probably a strong back from bending over the grain for hours. One can only imagine the grain for hours. Conversations, or perhaps the focused silence, as these preliminary guardians of the royal bread meticulously scan for imperfections. Hey, Senefer, look at the size of this rock. Pharaoh could break a divine tooth on this one. A command probably best muttered under one's breath. Alongside this hand-picking, initial sieving of the whole grains would occur. Now, these aren't the fine flour sieves we'll encounter later. These are coarser, designed to catch the larger debris that the eye might miss or that would be too numerous to pick out individually. Imagine wide, shallow baskets or wooden frames with a mesh made from woven reeds or pierced animal hide. Grain would be scooped in and then shaken or rocked. The good kernels would pass through, while the larger, unwanted bits, more stones, chaff, broken stalks, would remain to be discarded. The sound of the grain rustling against the sieve, the slight cloud of the finest dust, because you can never entirely escape it, rising into the air would be a constant backdrop to this stage. It's a known historical fact that ancient Egyptian granaries had measures for pest control, and tomb scenes frequently depict the processes of agriculture, including threshing and winnowing, which are themselves forms of cleaning. The attention paid to grain was paramount. What we're looking at in the royal bakery is likely a more refined, almost redundant level of this cleaning, ensuring that what reached the grinding stones was as pure as human effort could make it at this stage. Now, what about winnowing again? We know it happened in the fields, where the wind would carry away the light chaff, but could a more controlled version take place here, in the relative calm of the bakery courtyard? It's certainly plausible. Perhaps on a less windy day, or in a specially constructed three-sided booth, to create a gentle controlled draft, workers might toss the grain into the air from flat winnowing baskets. This would help to remove any remaining light chaff, dust, or even very fine, light sand particles that the coarser sieves missed. However, this would have to be done with extreme care, because if you create too strong a draft, you might just invite more ambient dust from the bakery surroundings to settle back onto your laboriously cleaned grain. It's a delicate balance, like trying to dust your furniture during a pollen storm. The question of washing the whole grain is an interesting one, and historians still debate the specifics of grain processing in different contexts. Could they have washed the grain to remove adhered dust and sand? On the surface, it seems like a logical step. Water is a great cleaner. After all, however, it presents significant challenges. Firstly, remember our discussion about the water quality itself. Unless they had access to exceptionally clear, settled water, washing might just replace one type of contaminant with another. Fine silt from the Nile, for instance. Secondly, washing makes the grain damp. Damp grain cannot be milled effectively. It would turn into a gummy paste under the grinding stones. So, if they did wash it, it would require a thorough drying process afterwards. Spreading grain out to dry in the Egyptian sun seems efficient, but then you're exposing it once more to, you guessed it, airborne sand and dust. It's a real catch-22. Plus, damp grain is far more susceptible to mold and spoilage, a disaster for any bakery, let alone one serving the Pharaoh. So, while washing might have been used in some capacity, it would have required a very careful and controlled drying stage, perhaps in a clean covered area with good airflow. It's more likely that dry cleaning methods, like meticulous sieving and hand-picking, were preferred for this initial stage. Think of the sheer volume. The royal household was large. The amount of bread baked daily would have been substantial. This wasn't just a handful of grain being processed. It was sack after sack. The systems for this initial cleaning had to be efficient enough to handle the quantity, yet thorough enough to meet the exacting standards. Perhaps different grades of grain were even identified. Some from a particularly clean harvest or a well-maintained granary might require less intensive initial cleaning than a batch that arrived looking a bit, shall we say, earthier. You can almost imagine a special seal of approval for extra clean grain, or might be a slightly suspicious, needs more work pile. One quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the intricate depictions of offerings on tomb walls and offering tables found in archaeological contexts. These often show perfectly formed loaves of bread, and sometimes even idealized, flawless heaps of grain. This wasn't necessarily a literal depiction of every single offering, but rather the ideal what the gods, and by extension Pharaoh Isha, receive pharaohized image, serves as a powerful reminder of the goal, absolute purity, and a perfection. The workers in the royal bakery, performing these initial, often monotonous cleaning tasks, were the unsung heroes striving to turn that ideal into a tangible, edible reality. This first cleansing was labor-intensive, no doubt. It required diligence, patience, and an eye for detail. It probably wasn't the most glamorous job in the bakery. No heroic wrestling with giant doughs or dramatic oven tending here. But it was utterly fundamental. Pebble, every piece of chaff removed at this stage, was one less contaminant to worry about later in the process. It was an investment of time and effort that would pay dividends in the quality of the final loaf. If this stage was rushed or done one carelessly, no amount of skill further down the line could fully compensate. The royal bakers knew that the journey to a sand-free crumb started right here, with the humble, unglamorous, but absolutely essential task of giving the grain its first meticulous scrub down. They were, in essence, the bouncers at the door of the milling process, deciding which kernels were clean enough to proceed to the next, even more challenging stage. All right, so you've witnessed the first heroic efforts in the royal bakery, where diligent hands and keen eyes have rescued the precious grain from the most obvious bits of field debris and opportunistic pebbles. The sacks of emmer or barley now, relatively free of external contaminants, are ready for the next crucial transformation. Milling. This is where the whole kernels become flour, the very soul of bread. But as you're about to discover, this stage, despite all the prior cleaning, is where one of the most insidious forms of sand, or rather stone grit, makes its grand, unwelcome entrance. The milling stone itself, the very tool meant to create the flour, carries a curse. It sheds. Imagine the scene. In a designated area of the bakery, perhaps slightly separate to contain the dust, are the grinding stations. For much of ancient Egyptian history, the primary tool for this arduous task was the saddle quern. Picture a slightly concave, oblong lower stone, thea, saddle, made of hard rock like sandstone, granite, or basalt. Resting on this is a smaller, loaf-shaped upper stone, the hand stone or rubber, which the grinder would push and pull back and forth across the grain, scattered on the saddle stone. It's a simple machine, but incredibly labor-intensive. You'd see workers, predominantly women in many depictions, kneeling or crouching behind these querns, their bodies rocking in a steady, powerful rhythm, hour after hour. The air would be air, thick with fine flour dust, coating everything and everyone, and the rhythmic, scraping, grating sound of stone on stone would be a dominant feature of the bakery's soundscape. Now, here's the rub. Literally, the grain is crushed and pulverized between these two stones. But no matter how hard the stone, the immense friction and pressure generated by the grinding action inevitably cause tiny particles of the quern itself to break away. These microscopic fragments of rock mingle directly with the flour. So, even if you started with the cleanest grain imaginable, the very act of grinding it introduces a fresh batch of grit. This isn't the wind-blown desert sand from the fields. This is stone dust coming directly from the tools. It's like trying to grate cheese with a grater made of compressed sand. You're going to get more than just cheese in your bowl. The material of the quernstones was critical. Sandstone, while effective for grinding, is by its very nature composed of compressed sand grains. As it wears, it releases these grains. Harder stones like basalt or granite might shed fewer and finer particles, but they would still shed, and these harder stones were more difficult to shape into querns in the first place, potentially making them more valuable or reserved for specific uses. The constant grinding wear meant that the surfaces of the saddle quern and handstone would gradually become smoother in some areas and rougher in others, would need periodic dressing or re-roughing to maintain their grinding efficiency. This process of re-roughening the stone surface, often done by pecking at it with another harder stone, could itself create more loose particles to be incorporated into the next batch of flour if not done carefully and cleaned meticulously afterwards. This is a mainstream historical fact. The saddle quern was a ubiquitous tool across many ancient cultures for millennia, used from the Neolithic period well into the dynastic era in Egypt and beyond, while rotary querns, which are more efficient and can sometimes produce finer flour with potentially less grit, did eventually appear. Their adoption was gradual for a long, long time. The back and forth motion of the handstone on the saddle quern was the primary way to make flour, and every single pass of that stone was a potential source of contamination. Think about the sheer physical effort involved. The grinder had to apply considerable downward pressure while pushing and pulling the handstone, which could weigh several kilograms. More pressure might mean faster grinding, but it could also mean more wear on the stones, and thus more grit in the flour. It's a direct transfer of energy into pulverized grain and pulverized rock. You can imagine the aching backs, the sore knees, the calloused hands of these workers. They were truly earning their bread and unintentionally seasoning Pharaohs with stone. This right here is a major contributing factor to that severe tooth wear we've seen in Egyptian mummies, which we've touched upon before. It wasn't just the desert sand that found its way into the fields. The stone particles from the milling querns consumed daily in bread acted like a fine abrasive, slowly but surely grinding down the enamel of their teeth. Even the pharaohs, despite all the efforts we're exploring, wouldn't have been entirely immune if any grit slipped through, though the goal was to minimize it drastically for them. The common populace, however, eating bread made with flour ground on well-used village querns, would have consumed a fair bit of this stone dust over their lifetimes. It gives a whole new meaning to stone ground flour, doesn't it? Perhaps the original packaging should have come with a dental disclaimer. Warning, might turn your molars into mesas. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about when and how quickly more advanced milling technologies, like the rotary quern, where a top stone rotates on a stationary bottom stone, often turned with a handle, were adopted in Egypt, particularly in official or large-scale operations like a royal bakery, while rotary querns became common in the Roman world. Their presence and widespread use in dynastic Egypt, especially in earlier periods, are less clear-cut. If a royal bakery Rydek have access to, say, imported rotary querns made of particular resilient stone, they might have been able to reduce this specific source of contamination. But the iconic image, and the one most frequently depicted, remains the saddle quern. One quirky, or perhaps rather grim, tidbit is that sometimes very small, discarded stone chips or fragments from the querns themselves are found in archaeological contexts associated with food preparation. These aren't just the microscopic particles. These are visible little bits. It's a stark reminder of just how direct the contamination could be. Imagine the horror of the royal baker if one of Gansu's made it into Pharaoh's loaf. It would be less sand-free and more surprise-filling. So, the freshly ground flour, now lying in a soft pale heap at the end of the saddle quern, is a paradox. It's the staff of life, the foundation of the bread, but it's also newly infused with the very essence of the stones that created it. The initial cleaning of the grain was vital, yes, but it couldn't prevent this intrinsic contamination. The curse of the milling stone meant that the battle against grit had to move to the next phase, dealing with the flour itself. The bakers in Pharaoh's service, knowing this, would be looking at that pile of flour not as a finished product, but as yet another patient requiring careful treatment. Their work was cut out for them. because getting those stone particles out of the flour was going to be an even more delicate operation than getting pebbles out of the whole grain. The milling process, essential as it was, had just handed them a fresh, finely powdered challenge. So, there you have it. The freshly ground flour, soft and pale, yet now insidiously mingled with microscopic shrapnel from the very stones that birthed it. The curse of the milling stone, as we've called it, seems inescapable. But you're in the Pharaohs Royal Bakery, remember, a place where good enough simply isn't. The pressure for perfection, for that divinely smooth loaf, was immense. So, the question naturally arises, did the ancient Egyptians, renowned for their ingenuity in so many other fields, just look at the pyramids, simply throw up their hands in resignation at this gritty problem? Or did they try to innovate at the source, to find ways to make the grinding process itself less of a contaminant fest? Let's delve into the realm of potential grinding innovations, or at least highly refined practices. The first and most obvious area for improvement would be the selection of the stone itself. Egypt, geologically speaking, is blessed with a wide variety of rock types. While common sandstone was readily available and easily worked into querns, it was, as we've established, a notorious shedder. However, Egypt also had access to harder, more durable stones like basalt, granite, and quartzite. These stones, being tougher and more resistant to abrasion, would logically shed fewer and finer particles during the grinding process. It's a historical fact that Egyptians were master stoneworkers, capable of quarrying, transporting, and shaping even the hardest granites for colossal statues and obelisks. It stands to reason that some of this expertise would have trickled down to the selection and manufacture of essential tools like querns, especially for an operation as critical as the royal bakery. You can imagine the overseer of the royal bakery, or perhaps a specialized master of querns, being extremely particular about the stones used. Perhaps there were designated royal quarries known for producing superior quality basalt, fine-grained and less prone to fracturing. These great quern stones might have been reserved exclusively for the pharaoh's flour. It wouldn't eliminate the grit problem entirely. Even the hardest stone will wear eventually, but it could significantly reduce the amount of stone dust produced. Getting these prime stones might have been a logistical challenge, more expensive, more difficult to shape, but for the sake of Pharaoh's palate and dental health, expense or effort would likely be spared. It's like choosing high-carbon steel for a chef's knife today instead of basic stainless steel. You're investing in better performance and durability. Beyond just selecting better raw materials, the preparation and ongoing maintenance of the quern stones would have been vital. A newly shaped quern, or one that has been freshly dressed, its surface re-roughened to improve grinding efficiency, would likely shed more loose particles initially. So, perhaps there was a breaking-in period for new or redressed querns. Might be they were used to grind a lesser quality grain first, or even just sand on sand for a while, to smooth out any initial roughness and remove loose fragments before they were certified for grinding the royal flour. Think of it as seasoning a new cast iron pan before you cook your prize-winning omelette in it. Furthermore, the skill of the worker dressing the stone was paramount. A skilled artisan could create a surface that was effective for grinding but didn't have too many sharp, easily broken projections. Constant inspection of the querns would also be necessary. A quern that was developing cracks or showing signs of excessive wear would need to be repaired or, more likely, retired from royal service. You wouldn't want a stone to catastrophically fail and dump a load of chunky debris into the flour mid-grind. That would be a Houston. We have a pebble moment that no one wanted. What about the grinding technique itself? While the basic back-and-forth motion of the saddle quern is fairly standard, it's possible that experienced grinders in the royal bakery were trained to use a specific pressure and rhythm, perhaps a lighter, more controlled touch, while lighter, potentially slower, might abrade the stones less aggressively than a forceful, hurried motion. It's a subtle point, and one that's hard to prove from archaeological evidence alone. But in an environment focused on minimizing grit, every little refinement would count. They might have been the original artisanal grinders, focusing on quality over sheer speed. Now, let's revisit the question of rotary querns, which we touched on as a matter of scholarly debate in the previous section. These devices, typically consisting of two circular stones, the upper one rotating on the lower, could be more efficient than saddle querns. But did they produce less grit? Potentially. The mechanics are different. With a well-made rotary quern using good quality stone, the wear might be more even, and the flour is often channeled out more systematically, which could offer better control over contamination. The royal household had access to the best available technology. They might have been among the earliest adopters of rotary querns in Egypt, even if these were still rare elsewhere. This is an area where historians continue to examine archaeological finds and interpret textual clues. Were there small, donkey-powered rotary mills, or even hand-turned ones, sequestered away in a corner of the palace bakery, dedicated to producing the finest, least gritty flour for the pharaoh's personal consumption? It's a tantalizing possibility. The initial investment in such a device might have been high, but the potential payoff in terms of flour quality would have been significant. One slightly quirky, speculative thought: could they have treated the thought stones in some way? Some cultures have historically soaked new grinding stones in water or other liquids, the idea being to wash out loose particles or even to somehow harden the stone surface or fill its pores. While direct evidence for such practices in ancient Egypt for quern stones might be lacking, the Egyptians were certainly familiar with various chemical processes. For example, in mummification or faience production, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility that some clever priest, scientist, or experienced quarryman stumbled upon a treatment that made quern stone slightly less prone to shedding, even if the science behind it wasn't fully understood. Hatshepsut's secret stone conditioner, now with extra ma? Probably not, but it's fun to ponder the undocumented ingenuities. Ultimately, even with the best stone selection, meticulous maintenance, skilled technique, and potentially more advanced for the time milling technology, some level of stone grit was likely unavoidable. The innovation, therefore, might not just have been in preventing grit at the source, but in acknowledging its inevitable presence and becoming hyper-efficient at removing it in the subsequent stages. However, any reduction at the grinding stage itself would make the later tasks of sifting and purification that much easier and more effective. The royal bakers weren't just passive victims of their tools. They were likely active participants in a continuous improvement process, always seeking an edge in their fight against the grit. Their deep understanding of their materials, born from generations of experience, would have guided them in selecting and using their milling stones to the best possible advantage, always striving for that elusive, perfectly smooth grind. Every innovation, however small, was a step closer to a loaf truly fit for a god. All right, you followed the journey of the grain from its initial, somewhat dusty arrival at the royal bakery, through a meticulous first cleansing, and then into the grinding process where, despite the best efforts to use superior stones and technique, some insidious grit from the querns themselves has inevitably joined the party. The resulting flour, while perhaps finer and less contaminated than what the average Egyptian might use, is still not quite up to divine standards, now ready to become dough, that magical alchemy of flour, water, and leaven that will eventually transform into bread. But this sticky, pliable stage presents its own set of challenges, and perhaps opportunities in the relentless battle against sand. Could the dough itself, or the way it was handled, act as a kind of sticky shield? Let's first consider the water. Every baker knows that water is a key ingredient, not just for hydration but for gluten development. In the context of the Pharaohs' bakery, the water added to the specially milled flour would have been subject to intense scrutiny. Remember our earlier discussions about Nile water carrying silt and fine sand. You can bet your last D-Ben that the water destined for the royal dough wasn't just scooped haphazardly from the nearest canal. It would likely come from dedicated, well-maintained cisterns or large pottery jars where it had been left to stand for a considerable time, allowing even the finest sediment to settle at the bottom. Only the clear water from the top, carefully decanted, would be deemed worthy. Perhaps there was even a rudimentary filtration system in place for the royal bakery's water supply, layers of linen, charcoal, or clean gravel, though direct evidence for sophisticated water filters specifically for baking is sparse. Historians still debate the nuances of water purification techniques available and commonly used in various Egyptian domestic and industrial settings. What is certain is that for this critical application, every effort would be made to ensure the water was as particle-free as humanly possible. Adding cloudy, sandy water would undo all the careful work done on the grain and flour up to this point. Now, imagine the kneading process. Tomb scenes often depict workers, usually men for this physically demanding task, kneading large quantities of dough in deep pottery troughs or on broad, flat boards. The kneading surfaces themselves would be a point of concern. If they were made of wood, the boards would need to be incredibly smooth, well-seasoned, and meticulously cleaned to prevent splinters or embedded dirt from contaminating the dough. Perhaps they used specific types of hard, close-grained wood, regularly scraped and scrubbed, might be, even with a final rinse of that specially purified water. If stone surfaces were used for kneading, they would have to be of a very hard, non-friable type, like polished basalt or granite, similar to the best quern stones, to avoid introducing yet more stone dust. The thought of kneading dough on a sandstone slab is enough to make your teeth ache in sympathy. The act of kneading is all about developing the gluten structure, making the dough strong and elastic. It also involves incorporating air, but in an environment where airborne dust is an ever-present foe, even within the relatively sheltered bakery. An uncovered, sticky mass of dough is like a magnet for any floating particles. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of finding a fly doing the backstroke in your soup, utterly unacceptable for Pharaoh. So you can envision strictable for Pharaoh protocols. Kneading might be done in a specific extra clean part of the bakery, perhaps even under a temporary canopy, or with attendants using large palm leaf fans, not to cool, but to gently direct airflow away from the precious dough, or, more simply, the dough would be covered with clean, damp linen cloths whenever it wasn't being actively worked. This is a common practice even today to prevent dough from drying out, but in ancient Egypt it would have had the crucial secondary benefit of acting as a barrier against dust. Could the kneading technique itself play a role in managing any residual grit that might still be lurking in the flour? This is more speculative. It's unlikely that kneading could remove sand in any significant way. Once those fine particles are in the flour, they are intimately combined. However, a thorough and vigorous kneading process ensures all ingredients are perfectly homogenized. Perhaps a very skilled baker, through long experience, could feel for any unusually large or coarse particles during kneading. Though this would be a long shot for the truly fine grit, it's more probable that the focus was on preventing additions and ensuring the dough's consistency was perfect for the subsequent sifting of the ifra, which we'll get to. A well-developed dough might also hold its shape better and be less sticky on its surface once the initial kneading is done, making it slightly less prone to picking up stray particles during handling and shaping. What about additives to the dough? Were there any secret ingredients that could help in the anti-sand campaign? It's highly unlikely they added anything with the express purpose of desanding the dough itself. However, the choice of leavening agent was important. The Egyptians were masters of sourdough, cultivating wild yeasts for their leaven. Mother dough or starter would have been a precious commodity in the royal bakery, carefully maintained and protected from contamination. Just like all the other ingredients, a keeper of the royal sourdough might have been a prestigious position, ensuring the starter was healthy, active, and, above all, clean. If your starter got gritty, your bread got gritty. Simple as that. Some breads were also enriched with ingredients like honey, dates, or certain fats. Flavor and texture. It's a remote possibility that some of these additions might have subtly altered the dough's properties in a way that made any remaining fine grit less perceptible. Though this is pure conjecture, the main focus would remain on physical removal and prevention. A quirky tidbit often seen in bakery scenes from tombs, like the tomb of Tai at Saqqara from the Old Kingdom, is the sheer variety of bread shapes: conical loaves, round flatbreads, tree and animal pieces, even animal or human shape. The skill required to shape these, especially from a potentially delicate, well-hydrated dough, was considerable. Each handling step was another point of potential contamination. So, bakers would need clean hands, clean tools, scrapers, knives, and those clean, perhaps lightly dusted, surfaces. Any flour used for dusting the boards or the dough itself would have to be of the utmost purity, probably flour that had already undergone the fine sifting process well discussed. Next, using regular flour for dusting would just reintroduce the problem. Oops, just sprinkled a bit of our finest sandstone dust on that perfectly shaped loaf for Pharaoh. My bad, not a career-enhancing move. So, while the dough stage wasn't primarily about removing sand that was already incorporated into the flour from the grinding stones, it was a critical juncture for preventing further contamination. Every surface the dough touched, every hand that shaped it, the very air around it, was a potential enemy. The royal bakers, through meticulous attention to their water quality, their working surfaces, by keeping the dough covered and by using only the purest ingredients for things like dusting flour, would have turned the dough-making process into a carefully controlled ballet. The sticky dough, which could so easily become a trap for more grit, was instead shielded and protected, ensuring that it arrived at the next stage as unblemished as possible, ready for its final purification before meeting the heat of the oven. You've seen the royal bakers navigate the treacherous path from sandy field to a relatively clean grain, then through the perilous milling process that, despite their best efforts with superior stones and techniques, still charges a toll in the form of fine rock dust. The flour, though milled with utmost care, now sits as a soft pale cloud, yet it harbors these tiny, unwanted stowaways. And you've observed the dough-making process, a master class in contamination prevention, where every surface, every touch, and the very water used were managed to avoid adding new grit. But what about the grit that's already in the flour, the microscopic legacy of the grinding stones? This is where the true hero of our sand-free saga steps into the limelight. The humble yet incredibly effective sieve. This is the great separator, the critical checkpoint where flour is purified, and Pharaoh's bread gets one giant leap closer to perfection. Imagine a dedicated station within the royal bakery, perhaps quieter, cleaner, and even more brightly lit than other areas. Here, you'd find workers, often women depicted in tomb scenes, engaged in the repetitive, yet vital task of sifting flour. Their tools are simple, shallow wooden frames or sturdy pottery rims, across which a carefully selected fabric is stretched taut. This fabric is the heart of the sieve, and for the ancient Egyptians, the prime candidate was linen. Egypt was renowned for its linen production, capable of weaving textiles of extraordinary fineness, some almost gossamer thin, fit for royalty and the gods. It's this mastery of linen weaving that would have been crucial for creating sieve meshes, fine enough to trap unwanted stone particles while allowing the precious flour to pass through. The quality of the linen used for these royal sieves would have been paramount. Not just any old cloth would do. You'd need threads of a consistent thickness, woven with incredible precision, to create uniform openings or apertures in the mesh too large, and the grit passes through with the flour, rendering the whole exercise pointless. Too small, and the flour itself struggles to get back through, making the process incredibly slow and inefficient, potentially even blocking the sieve entirely. It would have been a matter of expert judgment and specialized craftsmanship to produce sieve cloths of the perfect grade. Perhaps there were master weavers who specialized in producing these royal-grade sieve cloths, their skills as valued as those of the bakers themselves. A faulty sieve cloth, one with a tiny tear or an inconsistent weave, could compromise an entire batch of flour destined for Pharaoh's table. You can bet these sieve cloths were inspected as rigorously as the grain itself. Is that a whole merit, or are you trying to give Pharaoh a crunchy surprise? The process itself, while simple in concept, required patience and endurance. Flour from the grinding querns would be carefully scooped or poured onto the sieve. The worker would then gently shake, tap, or rock the sieve back and forth, sometimes over a large, clean pottery basin or a tightly woven mat. The finer flour particles would shimmy their way through the mesh, falling like a soft, pure snowfall into the collecting vessel below. What remained on top of the sieve cloth? A collection of the coarser bran particles, if they hadn't been removed earlier, or if a whiter flour was desired. Any stray bits of chaff that had somehow made it this far, and critically, the fine stone dust and sand particles shed from the grinding querns. This residue was the enemy, now isolated and trapped. It's a known historical fact that sieves of various materials, including woven fabrics and even pierced hides or pottery, were used in ancient Egypt for processing foodstuffs and other materials. Actual examples of ancient Egyptian sieves, or fragments thereof, have been discovered, confirming their use. Tomb depictions clearly show the act of sifting, illustrating its importance in the culinary process. Royal bakery. This wouldn't just be a quick pass. It might involve multiple siftings, perhaps through progressively finer sieves, to achieve the desired level of purity. The very finest flour, an almost ethereal powder, would be reserved for Pharaoh's personal bread. The slightly coarser, once sifted flour might be used for other members of the royal household or for less critical bakery products. It's like a modern refinery products. Egyptians words, fuel. The Egyptians words, producing different grades of flour with super premium unleaded sand-free at the top. What happened to the gritty residue left in the sieve? It certainly wouldn't be mixed back into anything edible, at least not for the royal kitchens. It would be carefully collected and discarded, perhaps thrown onto a waste heap, or might be even used for some entirely unrelated non-culinary purpose, where a bit of grit didn't matter, perhaps as a component in mud brick for an outbuilding, or just as a component in mud brick for an outbuilding. Return to the desert whence its sandy component came. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, grit to the garbage dump. The atmosphere at the sifting station would be one of quiet concentration, while flour dust would inevitably become airborne. During the process, efforts would be made to control it, perhaps by working in a well-ventilated but not drafty area, or by the workers wearing simple cloth coverings over their noses and mouths. If such practices were in use for comfort or hygiene, the rhythmic swish and tap of the sieves would be the dominant sound, a soft percussion in the symphony of the bakery. There's a scholarly debate surrounding the exact efficacy of ancient linen sieves against the very finest particles of stone dust. While they could undoubtedly remove larger sand grains and coarser stone fragments, could they capture particles that were almost as fine as the flour itself? The answer probably lies in the quality of the linen and the patience of the sifter. A very fine, tightly woven linen, used meticulously, could achieve a remarkable degree of separation, and if one sifting wasn't enough, they'd do it again. For Pharaoh, no effort was too great. The quirky idea of a chief sifter whose hands were insured by the treasury isn't too far-fetched when you consider the stakes. This stage of meticulous sifting was the linchpin of the entire sand-free bread operation. All the earlier steps, careful grain selection, attempts to use better grinding stones, protecting the dough, were vital. But it was the sieve that delivered the final purification of the flour. It was here that science, or at least empirical knowledge honed over generations, met artistry, the ability to create and use these simple tools to such effect. Speaks volumes about the ingenuity and dedication of these ancient culinary artisans. They were transforming a product, inherently flawed by its earthly origins, into something approaching divine purity. One patient shake of the sieve at a time. The soft white, sifted flour, now largely liberated from its gritty burden, was finally almost ready to become the bread that would grace the table of a god-king. You've witnessed the flour's miraculous transformation, sifted into a state of near-perfect purity, liberated from the gritty tyranny of the grinding stones by the diligent, almost magical intervention of the linen sieve. This pristine flour, the pride of the royal bakery, has been lovingly combined with purified water and the carefully nurtured royal leaven. The dough has been kneaded to perfection on spotless surfaces, every precaution taken to prevent any new airborne particles from crashing the party. Now, this nascent bread, this living, breathing entity full of hopeful yeast, must rest and rise. This is the proofing stage, a quiet interlude where the yeast works its magic, filling the dough with airy bubbles that will give the final loaf its light texture and delightful crumb. But even in this tranquil phase, the ever-present threat of sand means the bakers cannot truly rest. The precious dough, now at its most vulnerable and sticky, must be vigilantly guarded. The proofing process is essential for good bread. It's when the yeast ferments the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide gas. These gas bubbles get trapped by the gluten network, causing the dough to expand, often doubling or even tripling in volume. This aeration is what distinguishes a light, open-textured loaf from a dense, heavy brick. For the Pharaoh's table, where only the finest, most delicate bread would suffice, a proper proof was non-negotiable. But here's the catch. Proofing takes time, anywhere from an hour to several hours, depending on the dough, the ambient temperature, and the desired outcome. And during this extended period, the surface of the dough, often slightly tacky, is like an open invitation to any microscopic piece of dust or sand floating in the air. Remember those desert winds and the general dustiness of even the best-kept ancient environment. They haven't gone on holiday, so how did the royal bakers protect their precious cargo during this critical waiting game? The most straightforward and likely method was to cover the dough meticulously. We've already encountered the use of fine linen cloths in the bakery, and they would play a starring role here too. Large, clean, possibly slightly dampened linen cloths would be draped carefully over the proofing dough, whether it was rising in bulk in a large trough or already divided and shaped into individual loaves. These cloths would act as a breathable barrier, allowing gases from the fermentation to escape if necessary, but preventing airborne particles from settling on the sticky surface. You can imagine these cloths being laundered with the same care as the Pharaoh's own garments, reserved exclusively for this purpose, perhaps even bearing a special mark indicating royal dough use only. Do not use to polish chariots. Another common method, still used by bakers today, would be to place the dough in lidded containers or to cover bowls or baskets with other inverted vessels. Clean pottery bowls, wooden boxes with well-fitting lids, or even tightly woven baskets, perhaps lined with cloth to prevent sticking and to add another layer of protection, could serve as individual proofing chambers. If the dough was already shaped into loaves, these might be placed on clean wooden boards or trays and then covered. The key was to create a miniature, protected environment for each batch of dough, a safe haven from the sandy onslaught. It's like putting your most not valuable jewels in a velvet-lined box, except here the jewels are blobs of dough, and the velvet is a trusty linen cloth. The location chosen for proofing would also be critical. You wouldn't just leave the dough out in the busiest, draftiest part of the bakery. Instead, there would likely be a designated proofing area, a quiet corner, or even a small, dedicated room. This spot would be as sheltered as possible, away from general foot traffic, oven smoke, and any activity that might stir up dust. Ideally, it would also be warm and slightly humid, as yeast thrives in such conditions, leading to a better, faster rise. The Egyptians were no strangers to managing temperature and humidity, at least empirically. The warm spot were in a building, or how to create a more humid microclimate, perhaps by placing shallow pans of that purified water nearby, though this itself would need to be kept covered to prevent it becoming a dust trap. Scholars often debate the precise environmental controls ancient bakers could achieve, especially how they managed temperature fluctuations between day and night or across different seasons. But for a royal bakery, finding or creating a consistently warm, draft-free, and clean proofing zone would be a high priority. It's a historical fact that the ancient Egyptians were sophisticated brewers and bakers, understanding the principles of fermentation intimately. Their leavened bread, often made with emmer wheat, could achieve a good rise. This wouldn't happen by chance. It required careful management of the yeast and the proofing conditions. So, guarding the dough wasn't just about sand. It was also about ensuring the yeast day performed optimally. However, in the sandy context of Egypt, the anti-sand measures were an inseparable part of good proofing practice. One quirky tidbit to consider is the shaping of the loaves. If the dough was proofed in specially shaped baskets or molds, these would also need to be meticulously clean and designed to be easily covered. Sometimes proofing baskets are used to impart a pattern onto the crust of the bread. If so, you wouldn't want that pattern to be authentic dessert grit. The attention to detail would extend to every vessel the dough touched. Might be they had a chief of proofing vessels, whose job was to ensure every pot, basket, and cloth was spotless. You can almost hear the hushed tones in the proofing corner. Is that Pharaoh's special conical loaf properly tucked in? No peeking, and certainly no sneezing nearby. The vigilance required during proofing highlights the relentless nature of the fight against sand. It wasn't enough to clean the grain, mill it carefully, and sieve the flour. It wasn't enough to make the dough with pure water on clean surfaces, even when the dough was seemingly just sitting there, minding its own business and quietly inflating. It needed active protection. Each loaf destined for the royal table was like a tiny, precious infant being swaddled and kept safe from harsh realities of the outside world. The royal bakers were not just craftsmen. They were guardians, patiently watching over their rising treasures, ensuring that when the time came for the oven, the dough would be as pure, airy, and sand-free as humanly possible. The silence of the proofing room would only be broken by the soft sigh of rising dough and the even softer prayers of the bakers, hoping no rogue gust of wind found its way in. The dough, having patiently risen under its protective linen shroud, is now a swollen, airy promise of the bread to come. It's been shielded from airborne invaders, its purity fiercely guarded through every preceding step. But now comes the trial. By fire, the moment of transformation in the heart of the Egyptian oven. You'd think that the intense heat might be the ultimate purifier. But alas, the oven itself, along with its fuel and the very air currents it generates, presents a fresh set of challenges in our ongoing quest to keep Pharaoh's bread delightfully sand-free. This isn't just about baking. It's about navigating a fiery obstacle course where ash and airborne particles are the prime adversaries. Let's first consider the ovens themselves. Ancient Egyptians used several types. For flatbreads, a simple heated stone or a flat pottery griddle over an open fire might suffice. But these offer little protection from airborne ash. More common for leavened loaves, especially in a production bakery, was the tall, conical oven, often referred to by excavators as a beja-type oven, typically made of fired clay or mud brick. These ovens were preheated by burning fuel inside them until the walls themselves became intensely hot. The embers and excess ash would then ideally be raked out, and the dough loaf slapped directly onto the hot interior walls to bake, or sometimes placed on pottery sherds on the oven floor. You can immediately see the potential issue. How roughly could you really rake out all that fine ash? And what about the mud brick construction of the oven itself? Over time, with repeated heating and cooling, couldn't the interior surface of the oven shed tiny particles of baked clay, or yes, sand from the bricks themselves? The fuel used to heat these ovens is another critical factor. Wood was a relatively scarce and valuable commodity in much of Egypt, especially finer woods, while royal kitchens might have had better access to good quality charcoal, which burns hotter and cleaner with less ash than raw wood. A very common fuel source, particularly for large-scale baking, was dried animal dung now. Dung cakes are an efficient and readily available fuel, but they produce a significant amount of fine, flyaway ash. Imagine the interior of an oven after a dung fire. It would be coated. The bakers would need to be incredibly meticulous in cleaning out the oven before the bread went in. Perhaps they used long-handled brushes made of stiff plant fibers, or even a damp swab, to try and remove as much ash as possible from the baking surfaces. Any remaining ash could easily adhere to the sticky dough or get baked into the crust, creating a gritty, bitter bite that would most certainly not amuse Pharaoh. This bread tastes of, well, a donkey's breakfast, and not in a good way. This brings us to a key scholarly debate. How did ancient Egyptian bakers truly manage ash contamination, particularly with ovens where bread was baked directly on the floor or walls after the fire was removed? Some theories suggest they might have placed the dough on clean pottery sherds or special ceramic baking plaque that acted as a barrier between the loaf and the potentially ashy oven surface. Others propose that the initial blast of steam from moist dough hitting the hot oven walls might have created a momentary clean surface or caused fine ash to adhere to the walls rather than the bread. It's also possible that some types of bread were baked with the embers still present but pushed to one side, requiring very skillful management to avoid direct contact. Whatever the precise techniques, minimizing ash transfer was a constant battle. Then there's the issue of airflow and ventilation. A busy bakery with multiple ovens blazing would generate a lot of smoke and heat. Proper ventilation was essential for the baker's comfort and safety, but also had implications for sand and ash control. You'd need to draw smoke out, but without creating strong drafts that could rip up dust from the bakery floor or, even worse, pull in sandy air from outside. Egyptian architecture was adept at creating natural ventilation through strategically placed openings, courtyards, and perhaps even rudimentary chimney-like structures or roof vents in specialized buildings like bakeries. Finding that perfect balance, enough airflow to clear the smoke, but not so much that it brought in a fresh sandstorm, would have been a delicate art. Perhaps the royal bakery had higher ceilings or a more sophisticated ventilation system than a common village bakery, all designed to keep the air as still and clean as possible around the precious baking loaves. The very act of placing the dough into the hot oven and retrieving the baked loaves required care. Bakers likely used long wooden peels, similar to those used by pizza makers today, to slide loaves into the deeper parts of the oven and to pull them out. These peels would need to be kept scrupulously clean. If a peel picked up dirt or ash from the bakery floor and then touched the dough, the contamination was instant. You can imagine the bakers moving with a practiced, almost reverent grace around the ovens, their movements economical and precise to avoid disturbing any settled dust or dislodging particles from the oven structure. It's a historical fact that different styles of ovens were suited to different types of bread. The tall conical ovens were excellent for the typical Egyptian conical loaves, which could be slapped onto the sides. The heat radiating from the thick clay walls would bake them evenly. For flatter breads, perhaps a different, lower oven or a heavily preheated stone slab might be employed. Would have its own quirks regarding ash management and potential grit. The royal bakery, producing a wide variety of breads for the palace, might have had several different types of ovens in operation, each with its own dedicated team of specialists who knew its fiery temperament intimately. One quirky tidbit is the idea of using the oven's heat for a final, albeit risky, purification. Could a very hot oven surface essentially sear the outside of the dough so quickly that minor surface particles were either incinerated or sealed into the crust in a less noticeable way? It's a bit of a long shot, and certainly not a reliable method for dealing with significant grit, but the intense heat would at least sterilize the surface. More likely, the focus remained on preventing particles from getting there in the first place. Perhaps they even had a special finishing oven, one that was exceptionally clean, used only for the final browning of loaves that had been partially baked in a primary, hotter, and potentially ashier oven. This is speculative, but illustrates the lengths to which they might go. So, as you picture those loaves finally going into the oven, understand that the vigilance doesn't stop. The fiery heart of the bakery, while essential for transforming dough into delicious bread, is also a potential minefield of last-minute contamination. The royal bakers, armed with their specialized knowledge of fuels, oven management, and airflow dynamics, would be working skillfully to ensure that the only thing that kissed Pharaohs' bread in that intense heat was the pure, transformative power of the fire itself, not a lingering film of ash or a stray speck of dislodged oven brick. The smell of baking bread would fill the air, a testament to their impending success, but only if they navigated this final, fiery hurdle with their usual meticulous care. The air in the royal bakery is now heavy with the intoxicating aroma of freshly baked bread. Golden brown loaves, in various shapes and sizes, are being carefully extracted from the fiery maw of the ovens by skilled hands wielding long, clean wooden peels. The transformation is complete. Humble flour, water, and yeast have become the staff of life, fit for a god king. But even now, as these beautiful creations emerge, steaming and fragrant, the battle against sand and its grimy accomplice ash isn't quite over. These baked loaves face a few final hurdles, a last meticulous inspection and primping, before they can be declared truly ready for the Pharaoh's discerning palate. This is the spit and polish stage, ancient Egyptian style, where any lingering imperfections are addressed with the utmost care. Imagine the scene as a fresh batch is pulled from the oven. The first thing that happens is an intense visual inspection. The head baker or a trusted assistant with an eagle eye would scrutinize each loaf. Is the color perfect? Is the crust intact? And most importantly, are there any visible specks of ash clinging to the surface, or any tiny particles that might have been dislodged from the oven wall during baking? Remember, despite all the careful oven cleaning and fuel selection we discussed, a stray fleck of ash was always a possibility. For most households, a little ash might be brushed off without a second thought. For Pharaoh, it was a blemish on eye perfection. If any superficial ash or loose particles were detected, the primary tool for dealing with them would be a soft brush. You can envision specialized brushes, perhaps made from fine, pliable plant fibers like palm leaf bristles or even bundles of soft linen, kept solely for this purpose. Gently, carefully, the baker would flick or brush away any offending specks from the crust. This wouldn't be a vigorous scrubbing that could damage the delicate surface, or, heaven forbid, rub the particle, wrinkle, the bread. It would be a light, almost feathery touch, more like a sculptor dusting a masterpiece than a scullery maid scrubbing a pot. Each brushstroke would be precise, ensuring that only the unwanted particle was removed, leaving the beautiful crust unmarred. One can only imagine the pressure. Don't mess up the divine crust, Bakari, or it's crocodile time for that brush while. What about scraping? If a particle was more stubbornly adhered, would they resort to scraping it off? For bread destined for the Pharaoh himself, this would be highly undesirable. Scraping implies a more significant flaw, and could leave an unsightly mark or even break the crust, exposing the softer crumb to potential contamination or drying out. It's more likely that a loaf requiring actual scraping would be discreetly diverted, perhaps to lesser officials or for use in other palace kitchen preparations where it wouldn't be presented whole. The ideal was a loaf that needed no such remediation, however. If a tiny, isolated speck was truly stuck, a very careful flick with the edge of a small sharp blade, perhaps a specially kept flint or obsidian flake, or a fine copper tool, might be attempted, but it would be a risky maneuver. The aim was flawless presentation. Once any necessary, and hopefully minimal, surface tidying was complete, the loaves couldn't just be piled up anywhere. They needed to cool, and this cooling stage was another potential pitfall. Hot bread releases steam, and if placed on a solid, non-braidable surface, the bottom crust can become damp and soggy. A damp surface is also more likely to pick up any stray dust or dirt from the surface it's resting on. Therefore, the royal bakers would have used clean cooling racks. These could have been made of woven reeds or rushes, forming a lattice that allowed air to circulate all around the loaf, or perhaps wooden frames with stretched cords or fabric. These racks, like every other piece of equipment in this high-stakes bakery, would be kept scrupulously clean, regularly washed or brushed down, and inspected to ensure they weren't shedding fibers or harboring any grime. Remember, the bread has come this far in its journey towards purity. No one wanted it to fail at the finish line by picking up dirt from a grubby cooling rack. The handling of the bread, even at this stage, would continue to be meticulous. Clean hands were a must, naturally, but often. Bakers would use clean linen cloths to hold or move the hot loaves, both to protect their hands and to provide another barrier against any accidental contamination. These wouldn't be the same cloths used for wiping down surfaces or for rougher tasks. These would be bread handling cloths, kept pristine. It's a historical fact that offering tables depicted in tombs and temples are laden with seemingly perfect, blemish-free loaves of bread, often piled high in aesthetically pleasing arrangements. This is the idealized image, the standard to which the royal bakers aspire daily. While the practical reality of a busy production bakery might occasionally involve a minor touch-up, the goal was always to produce loaves that mirrored this divine perfection from the moment they left the oven. A quirky tidbit to consider is the possibility of glazes. Some Egyptian breads or cakes were sweetened or decorated with a coating of honey or a wash made from fruit juices or other ingredients. If such a glaze was to be applied, it would typically happen after baking, while the loaf was still warm. This would require an incredibly clean surface on the bread to begin with, as any trapped particles would be sealed in by the glaze, perhaps even magnified like a bug in amber. The application of a glaze would be yet another stage requiring utmost care and clean tools. There's a scholarly debate about the actual waste or rejection rate in a royal bakery. Really happened to loaves that, despite all efforts, didn't quite meet the mark? Were they immediately discarded, fed to the bakery hounds, if such existed? Or were there gradations of acceptability, with slightly imperfect loaves being channeled to lower-ranking members of the vast royal household? The paramount concern was always what reached Pharaoh's own table. That had to be beyond reproach. So, as the loaves cool, their fragrant steam mingling with the warm bakery air, you can see the final quality control checks being performed. Each loaf is a testament to the skill, patience, and almost obsessive cleanliness of the royal bakers. From the initial battle against sand in the grain to this last gentle brush-off of an errant ash fleck, every step has been a calculated move-in, a high-stakes game. The baked loaf, now cool enough to handle, represents a victory, a small, edible triumph of order and purity over the ever-present gritty chaos of the outside world. It's almost ready for its ultimate destiny. The loaves are now cool, arrayed perhaps on clean linen laid over woven trays, each one a testament to the royal bakery's relentless pursuit of perfection, the aroma of freshly baked bread, a scent that usually brings comfort and delight. Here in the inner sanctums of the palace carries an undercurrent of nervous anticipation. For these are not just any loaves. They are destined for the divine Pharaoh, and their final journey from the bakery to the royal table is guarded by a scrutiny so intense it could make stones sweat. This is the moment of reckoning, where all the meticulous cleaning, sifting, kneading, guarding, and baking culminates in a final, terrifying judgment. The baker's skill, diligence, and perhaps even their career hang in the balance. Imagine a formal handover. The chief baker, his face a mask of calm but his heart likely pounding like a ceremonial drum, would oversee the presentation of the day's finest yield. The bread wouldn't just be casually sent over. It would be formally presented to a high-ranking official, perhaps the royal steward, the overseer of the royal household, or a designated chamberlain whose responsibilities included the king's provisions. This individual would be no fool. They'd be acutely aware of the Pharaoh's exacting standards and the dire implications of any lapse. Their own position might depend on ensuring that only flawless items reached the royal presence. Before the bread even got close to Pharaoh, it would undergo at least one, if not several, layers of quality control. The most critical of these would likely involve a trusted royal taster. This wasn't just a job for someone who liked bread. This was a position of Pharaoh, immense trust and considerable peril. The royal taster, a role known in various forms throughout ancient courts, The cupbearer often tasted wine, for instance, a practice well attested in Egypt, and the wider ancient Near East was responsible for ensuring the food was not only of high quality but also safe, free from poison. Yes, but in this context, also free from that insidious enemy, sand. This individual would literally hold the fate of the bakers, and perhaps a bit of their own, in their mouth. Picture the scene. A quiet, dedicated chamber, perhaps adjacent to the royal dining preparation areas. The selected loaves, the crème de la crème of the bakery's output, are presented. The tester, perhaps robed in spotless white linen, would approach their task with solemnity. First, a visual inspection, even more intense than the one performed in the bakery. They'd examine the crust's color, texture, and integrity. Then, they might gently handle the loaf, feeling its weight, its springiness. The crucial moment would be breaking the bread, the sound it made, the appearance of the crumb, its evenness, its aeration. All would be noted. Then, a small piece would be taken. The tester would feel it between their fingers, subtly checking for any hint of grittiness. And finally, the taste test. They would chew slowly, thoughtfully, their entire being focused on detecting that single, telltale grain of sand, that minute particle of stone, dust that might have evaded all previous safeguards. It's like being a human super detector, your senses honed to an almost unbelievable degree of sensitivity. You'd need nerves of steel and taste buds of gold. The silence in that room would be profound, broken only by the gentle tearing of bread and the almost inaudible sounds of mastication. The bakers, even if not physically present, would feel the psychic weight of this moment. Their reputation, their livelihood, and potentially their liberty rested on that taster's verdict. If the bread passed, if it was deemed smooth, pure, and delicious, a collective sigh of relief would ripple back to the bakery. Another day, another triumph. Consistent excellence might bring rewards, perhaps bonuses, in grain, linen, or other valuables, promotions, or simply the continued favor of the palace authorities, which was a reward in itself. The chief baker might even earn a fancy title, like friend of Pharaohs' digestion. But what if a sandy offering was discovered? What if, despite all the painstaking effort, a loaf was found wanting? The consequences could be severe. At the very least, the offending loaf, or the entire batch it came from, would be rejected, a mark of shame and failure for the bakery. The chief baker would face a terrifying interrogation. Was it negligence, sabotage, incompetence? In a society where Pharaoh was a god and Ima'at, cosmic order and purity, was paramount, providing impure food to the divine ruler wasn't just a culinary mistake. It could be seen as a dangerous lapse, an invitation to chaos, a potential threat to the well-being of Pharaoh himself. Remember those worn teeth from commoners. That was not an acceptable outcome for the son of Ra. Punishments could range from demotion or dismissal to something far more serious, depending on the perceived severity and frequency of the offense. Ancient Egyptian society had a justice system, but for offenses against the divine order or the person of Pharaoh, it could be swift and harsh. We don't have detailed HR manuals from Pharaoh's palace outlining the disciplinary procedures for excessive sand content in royal bread, but the general understanding is that failure in high-trust positions carried significant risks. One can only imagine the terror of a baker summoned to explain why the divine ruler crunched down on a piece of their own grinding stone. It wouldn't be a pleasant conversation, perhaps a demotion to cleaning the crocodile enclosures, where grit was a bit more expected, There's a scholarly debate about the exact legal and social ramifications of such failures within the palace hierarchy. Their formal inquest was it considered a religious offense. While specific case studies are rare in the record, the overall emphasis on purity in all things connected with the pharaoh strongly suggests that such lapses would not be taken lightly. The entire system of producing sand-free bread was an immense undertaking involving significant resources and manpower. Failure to deliver would be seen as a monumental waste and a sign of systemic breakdown within that baker's domain. A quirky, though perhaps morbid, thought. Did the royal tasters ever develop phantom grit syndrome, where the constant pressure and fear made them imagine sand even when there was none? Or did they have a secret signal to the bakery? One cough for perfect, two coughs for you are all fired. The psychological stress on everyone involved in this chain of production and inspection must have been immense. So, this final scrutiny was the ultimate gateway. It was the point where the baker's earthly efforts met divine expectations. The fine, royal taster and the overseeing officials were the stern guardians of Pharaoh's palate, the final line of defense against the gritty scourge of the desert. Their approval meant that the bread was not just food, but a worthy offering, a symbol of offering, the order and perfection that Pharaoh embodied. And for the bakers, it meant they could breathe again. Until the next day's baking began, the sigh of relief from the royal bakery is almost palpable as their perfect, sand-free loaves pass the ultimate test and are deemed worthy of the divine Pharaoh. The primary mission, the one that has consumed so much effort and meticulous attention, is accomplished for the day. But as you stand in the heart of this vast royal culinary complex, a thought might drift into your mind. Was this intense sand consciousness, this obsessive pursuit of purity, confined only to bread, or did it ripple outwards, influencing the preparation of all foodstuffs destined for the royal table? It stands to reason that if Pharaoh couldn't abide grit in his daily bread, he certainly wouldn't appreciate an unexpected crunch in his figs or a sandy film on his roasted duck. Let's briefly peek into other areas of the royal kitchen. Beverages, for instance. Beer and wine were staples of the Egyptian diet, consumed by all classes, but the versions gracing Pharaoh's goblet would have been of a far superior quality. Ancient beer, often thick and nutritious, and wine, cultivated in royal vineyards, both had a natural tendency to produce sediment. Just like with today's craft beers or unfiltered wines, dregs and particles would settle at the bottom of storage jars and drinking vessels. For the royal service, you can be certain that meticulous decanting was standard practice. The beverage would be carefully poured off, leaving the sediment behind. Furthermore, it's highly probable that fine linen cloth, that same versatile material used for sifting flour and a protecting dough, would be employed to filter wine and perhaps even finer beers, ensuring a smoother, clearer, and critically grit-free quaff. No royal toast should be accompanied by a mouthful of vineyard soil or brewery floor sweepings. There are the fruits and vegetables plucked from the fertile gardens and fields along the Nile. While the common Egyptian might give their dates a quick rinse in canal water, produce destined for Pharaoh would receive a far more thorough spa treatment. Imagine plum figs, luscious grapes, crisp lettuces, and sweet melons arriving at the palace kitchens. They would undoubtedly be washed multiple times, using that same specially settled and purified water we encountered in the bakery. Any visible dirt or sand clinging to skins or leaves would be gently but firmly removed. For many items, peeling would be standard procedure, not just for hygiene but also for refinement. An apple a day might keep the doctor away, but a sandy apple would bring the royal physician running for entirely different reasons. Probably to treat a chipped divine tooth, Meat and fish, central to the elite Egyptian diet, also required careful handling. Animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and fowl, as well as a bounty of fish from the Nile, would be butchered and prepared within the palace precincts or by trusted suppliers. The butchering process itself, especially if done in an open-air setting, could introduce contaminants. You can be sure that royal butchers and fishmongers were under strict instructions to maintain cleanliness, and that cuts of meat and cleaned fish were thoroughly rinsed before cooking. If meat was to be roasted over an open fire or grill, popular cooking methods, immense care would be taken to prevent sand kicked up by movement or wind from adhering to the sizzling flesh. Perhaps dedicated, sheltered grilling pits were used, or screens erected to shield the cooking food. The image of a royal chef frantically fanning away a mini sand devil from Pharaoh's prize-winning rack of lamb comes to mind. Even composite dishes, like stews or savory porridges, would begin with impeccably clean ingredients. Every lentil, every onion, herb would undergo scrutiny before being added to the pot. The cooking pots themselves, likely made of pottery or sometimes copper or bronze for the elite, would be kept scrupulously clean inside and out. Any water or stock used as a base would be, of course, of that purified royal grade. The goal was a harmonious blend of flavors, not a surprise textural element from the desert floor. What about sweeteners like honey? Honey was highly prized in ancient Egypt, used not just as a food but also in medicine and rituals. It was typically stored in sealed pottery jars to protect it from ants and other contaminants. When honey was to be used for sweetening pharaohs' dishes or drinks, it would be carefully ladled or poured, ensuring that no crystallized bits from the bottom of the jar, which might sometimes contain beeswax or other hive debris, or even dust if the jar wasn't perfectly sealed, made their way into the final preparation. Purity was paramount even for the nectar of the gods. Lists of food offerings found in tombs, intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, are incredibly extensive, featuring a wide array of meats, birds, breads, cakes, fruit, vegetables, and drinks. This gives us a clear indication of the rich and varied diet enjoyed by the elite. It's a mainstream historical fact that such lists demonstrate the agricultural abundance available and the culinary sophistication achieved. Each item on that list, when prepared for the living pharaoh, would have been subject to this same overarching concern for purity and freedom from contamination. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, about the precise level of fastidiousness across all food types and how it might have varied between different pharaohs or dynasties. Was the sand-free protocol as rigorously applied to a humble side dish of lentils as it was to the main course of roasted goose or the ceremonial bread? Logic suggests that anything destined for the pharaoh's direct consumption would meet the highest possible standards. The underlying principle of vima'at and the divine status of the ruler demanded it. One quirky tidbit relates to the use of natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, famously used in mummification. Natron was also used as a cleansing agent and, in some contexts, for preserving fish or meat. However, natural natron deposits can contain impurities, including sand and salt. If natron was ever used in or around royal food preparation, perhaps for cleaning certain vessels or in a highly refined form for preservation, its purity would have been another factor to control meticulously. You wouldn't want your mummifying agent to accidentally season the soup. So, while our deep dive has focused on the extraordinary efforts to produce sand-free bread, it's clear that this sand consciousness was likely a pervasive philosophy within the royal kitchens. The bakers might have been the specialist warriors in the daily fight against grit in their particular domain. but the entire culinary staff, from the head chef down to the pot washers, would have been enlisted in the broader campaign to ensure that every morsel and every sip offered to Pharaoh was as clean, pure, and delightful as human ingenuity and tireless effort could make it. The royal table was intended as an oasis of perfection in a gritty world. No! And so, you've journeyed with us through the sandy landscapes of ancient Egypt, deep into the heart of the royal bakery, witnessing the extraordinary lengths to which Pharaoh's culinary artisans went to achieve that elusive dream, a delightfully sand-free loaf of bread. From the first meticulous cleaning of the grain, battling impurities blown in by desert winds, to the careful selection of grinding stones, the laborious sifting of flour through fine linen sieves, the guarding of thick, rising dough, and the perilous navigation of ash and grit in the fiery ovens, every step was a testament to their dedication and ingenuity. You've seen how this pursuit wasn't just about good taste. It was deeply intertwined with concepts of divine purity, cosmic order, Ima'atan, and the sheer prestige of the royal household. But after all this effort, this almost obsessive attention to detail, how successful were they, really? Could they truly achieve a loaf that was 100% sand-free by our modern, microscopic standards? Probably not. In an environment so thoroughly permeated by sand, with the technology available to them, eliminating every single microscopic particle would have been an almost impossible feat. However, it's crucial to consider success in its context. The goal was to produce bread that was perceived as pure and smooth by the highly refined palate of the pharaoh and his court, bread that was in stark, luxurious contrast to the unavoidably gritty fare consumed by the general populace, and in this they undoubtedly achieved a remarkable degree of success. The very existence of such elaborate, multi-stage purification processes, the specialized tools, and the dedicated personnel all point to a system that could significantly reduce sand content to a level deemed acceptable, even delightful, for the divine ruler. The difference between a royal loaf and a commoner's loaf, texturally speaking, would have been night and day, or perhaps smooth silk versus rough sandpaper. The legacy of these ancient bakers isn't just in the bread itself, but in what their efforts tell us about their culture. It speaks to a profound appreciation for order and cleanliness, an ability to innovate within constraints, and an unwavering commitment to upholding the highest standards for their gods and rulers. It's a historical fact that bread in myriad forms was not only a dietary staple, but also a significant offering to the gods and a crucial provision for the gods' afterlife, as evidenced by the loaves and bakery models found in tombs. This elevates the baker's craft from mere food production to an act of religious and cultural significance. Ensuring the purity of these offerings was, therefore, of far paramount importance. Yet, for all we've uncovered, enduring mysteries remain. What were the exact mesh sizes of their finest linen sieves, and what precise particle dimensions could they reliably filter out? How did they consistently manage oven temperatures without thermometers, achieving that perfect bake time after time? What were the secret family recipes, perhaps, for certain royal breads, passed down through generations of master bakers? And what was the true social standing of a baker who had mastered the art of the grit-free loaf? Was he lauded as a hero, or simply an anonymous cog in the vast palace machinery, his daily anxieties and triumphs unrecorded? There's still much that scholars debate, piecing together clues from tomb reliefs, archaeological finds of tools and bakeries, and textual references. For instance, the sheer variety of names for breads and cakes found in ancient Egyptian texts, dozens, if not hundreds, hints at a highly sophisticated baking culture, where texture, and by implication, The absence of sand would have been a key differentiator. The exact recipes and techniques for many of these, however, are lost to time. One quirky thought is to wonder if, after all that effort for the pharaoh, the bakers themselves occasionally indulged in a slightly earthier loaf, perhaps finding a perverse comfort in the familiar grit that connected them to their land and their land less exalted kin, or maybe the chief royal Saiv inspector had nightmares about finding a single rogue grain of sand that had slipped through his watch, leading to a national crisis. The human element, the daily pressures, and small victories are what bring this ancient craft to life. The dedication of Pharaoh's bakers to their craft, their relentless battle against an ever-present environmental foe, is a quiet story of human ingenuity and perseverance. They didn't have advanced filtration systems or air purifiers, yet they strived for a level of purity in their product that was truly exceptional for their time. Their work was a daily affirmation of order over chaos, refinement over coarseness, a culinary echo of the fair, grander cosmic balance they believed their pharaoh maintained. Their grit-free glory wasn't just in the eating. It was in the astonishing, painstaking effort of the making. And now, as the story of these diligent bakers and their quest for the perfect sand-free loaf draws to a close, allow the echoes of their ancient ovens and the soft rustle of their linen sieves to gently fade. The challenges they faced, born from the very land that sustained them, were met with a quiet determination and a skill honed over countless generations. The golden loaves, symbols of life and divine sustenance, were the culmination of an extraordinary, almost invisible, daily struggle against the pervasive dust of the desert. As you reflect on their world, a world where even the simplest mouthful could be a battleground for purity, let your own mind begin to settle, letting go of the day's cares, just as those ancient bakers carefully covered their precious dough, shielding it from the troubles of the outside world. The night offers a similar sanctuary, a quiet space for rest and gentle dreams. The soft glow of the bakery fires dims now. The rhythmic sounds of work give way to the stillness of the Egyptian night. The stars emerge over the vast, silent desert, the same stars that once looked down upon the pharaoh's realm and the diligent subjects who served him, even in the humble, essential art of baking. May your own rest be as peaceful and untroubled as the most perfect, sand-free dream.